Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast.
Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to John Constantine, a Hellblazer podcast. Today, we are reading Hellblazer number 152. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. In the last issue, we saw John hitchhiking through parts of the southern states of America in order to get to a town called Doglick, which is where he's been heading since getting out of prison in the first Brian Azzarello arc. At the end of the last issue, we saw John just kind of walking on the freeway or the highway on the way to Doglick. And that's where we left off. So first things first, with issue 152, we got the cover. We see a map background again. We got this motif that's happening with this story arc. And on top of that, there's a panel of a man that looks like he's about to beat someone to death. He's got a pipe in his hands. He's a white guy with cut off sleeveless shirt. And he's got a tattoo that says rich or something like that on it. And he's got red hair and a goatee. And behind him, we see John, who's just kind of staring at him, and he's pulling out a cigarette to light it. And we also see on this cover that this is written by Brian Azzarello, with art by Marcelo Fruchin. And we start off on the first page where we see John walking once again on the side of the road, and he's smoking, and we see finally he gets to a sign that says Doglick, population 1,276. And over that, his narration is saying, I had this friend, name of Rose, a nice girl, bit severe, but nice. We had a lot in common, and yes, there was an attraction, but we never actually did it, if you catch my drift. Was another man, see? And while she wasn't actually me confidant, I found myself ringing her up whenever I was pissed and feeling sorry for myself. Anyway, long story short, after a particularly nasty job blew shit up in me face, we was talking, and I was prattling on and asking her, why do you always end up in bad places? And without missing a beat, she says, don't you see, John? It's you what makes them bad. And we also see on this page that the name of this issue is Good Intentions Part 2. Then we turn the page and we cut to somewhere unknown. It looks like it's a warehouse, and we see the man from the cover, the white guy with the sleeveless shirt. And I don't remember if I mentioned, but he also has red hair, which kind of sets him apart, and he has a goatee. And he is sitting and staring at a man who he is tied to a concrete pillar in this warehouse. And the man has a device in his mouth that keeps it open, like the kind you would use in a dental office. And the man tied up is begging the man from the cover, saying, Reese, Reese, because he can't really enunciate with that device in his mouth. And the man from the cover looks up and says, shush. And sleeping on the ground next to him is a big mastiff dog. Then the guy from the cover stands up and he walks over to the tied up man. And he does have that piece of pipe he had on the cover as well. And with almost zero emotion and a dead face, he puts that piece of pipe up to the man's mouth and proceeds to very methodically knock out the man's teeth. Luckily, we don't see it exactly, but we do see him just kind of jabbing the pipe towards us, and we hear tink, tink, crack, tink, tink, crack. And of course, screams as well. And as this is happening, we actually cut to the outside of the building as we turn the page, and the screams are coming from the window, and we see another man watching this kind of gleefully. And then off to the side, we see the silhouette of a man in a trench coat walking up, and of course, that is John. And the man who is watching in the window, he looks like he's homeless because he has a shopping cart full of bottles and stuff. But he sees John and he decides to walk over to him. And as he approaches John, he just says, say there, fancy pants, you some kind of queer? And John just kind of smirks at him and says, no. Why you ask? And then the homeless guy points to himself and says, 'cause I am. And then gets a big grin on his face. But we don't see what really happened after that, because as we turn the page, we see John walking into a motel. And he walks into quite a scene here because the guy that's at the front desk of the motel is also about to clean and dress a chicken. But he hears John come through the door and he asks, what can I do for you? And John replies, I'll be needing a room. And the man asks, what for? And John answers sarcastically, sleeping, I suppose. And the man walks over to the desk, and he looks John right in the eyes, still holding the dead chicken, and he says, $19 a night. And once again, John sarcastically asks, that include a bed? And the man answers, course, and a turlet. MasterCard or Visa? And John says, cash. And the man asks, you ain't got no credit card? And John replies, no, afraid I ain't got no credit card. And the man looks at him very shrewdly and says, $19 in advance, and then holds out his hand for the cash. Then the man pulls down his glasses and looks at John hard, like he's giving him a once-over, and he asks, and what brings a fella like you to Doglick? And John smiles, and then he says, me conscience, actually. Then he asks as he passes the money, this establishment of yours, it has room service? And the man answers, depends. What do you need? And John answers, a drink. Then the man points to the right of the room and says, just round the corner here. We got a bar. And as John walks that way into the bar, the man says, enjoy your stay. Then we cut to the bar, and I thought this was kind of funny. The bartender is the same guy, so John had to wait for him to walk over there. And as he gets behind the bar, he asks John, what'll it be? And John says, kind of annoyed, I'll have a pint. And the man looks at him like that's not going to happen, but he walks over to a little mini fridge and he pulls out a beer and he says, pint? I ain't got no pints. Beer in a can. And John says, right, one of those then. And then he hands John the beer, and John's hand is kind of blocking the label, but it definitely looks like a regular Budweiser. Then John sees something in the room that interests him, and he stands up and he walks towards a dartboard. And he says, well, what do we have here? And the bartender says, them's darts. It's a game. And as John collects the darts from the dartboard, he turns to the bartender and says, no, squire. It's much, much more than just a game. And he says that with a look on his face that kind of makes you think he's got something up his sleeve. Then we turn the page and we cut to somewhere else unknown. It is a bedroom, and specifically a bed where we see a naked man sleeping. And this guy's got a full back tattoo of like a bunch of different kind of gambling things on his back. There's an 8-ball from pool and some dice and a topless woman and a deck of cards. And he also looks a lot like the man with red hair from earlier, but he's got gray hair. But it's in the exact same style as the man from before that was knocking the guy's teeth out with a pipe. And we hear someone off panel ask, Dickie? And we zoom out and we get a silhouette of a woman in the doorway, and she's in her underwear, and she's saying, it's 3 o'clock, hun. Wake up. And the man does wake up, but very sleepily he says, 3? What'd you let me sleep so late for? And the woman answers, I tried to get you up at 1, but you took a swing at me. And as Dickie sits up, he says, oh, sorry about that, sugar. Hand me my phone, would you? Then he makes a call on his cell phone, and we don't hear the other side of the conversation, but he says, hey, Richie, set up for later? Well, find his ass, and I don't want to hear about none of his bullshit excuses. None of yours either. Then he stops and listens to whatever Richie is saying on the phone to him, and we see the silhouette of the woman in the doorway walk towards him, and he is standing up, and like I said, he's naked, and she walks up to him, and as he's still on the phone, she walks very close to him, and we don't see exactly what she's doing with her hands, but it is at his waistline, so we can assume it's something sexual, and he's still talking to Richie saying, me? Hell yeah, I'm ready. Which kind of works for both scenarios, either with the woman or whatever Richie's asking to do. Then we cut to some time later outside on the road. We see Dickie driving, and of course he's talking on his phone still in there, and he's asking, so what's the word? And once again, we don't hear what the other person's saying on the phone, but Dickie replies, that's fucking horseshit, brother, and you know it. Goddamn unreliable son of a bitch is all he is. Don't know why I even bother. Yeah? Well, you listen to me, Richie. There's a goddamn buttload of money to be made, goddammit, and we're on the motherfucking ground floor. We're working tonight, understand? No ifs, ands, or goddamn buts. Now you make sure he's ready to go, all right? This ain't no 2-man operation. And as he's talking, we see him get into town, and then he pulls up to a building that has the word bar on the window. And then as he gets out, he says, "I'll be over in a piece. You got me all fucking worked up. I gotta calm my ass down. Later." And just as he's pushing the door to the bar open, he says under his breath, "Shit for brains." But then as he comes through the door, we get a interesting panel of a dart flying through the air, leaving a hand, and the door is about to be opened, and we see the shadow of Dickie on it. And then as the dart flies past Dickie's face and lands into the wood of the door, right at eye height of Dickie, Dickie turns looking very annoyed, and he stares at John, and John says, "Sorry, mate. It got away from me, you know?" And Dickie kind of scowls at him and then removes the dart from the door, and then he says, "Constantine." And then John looks at him with a scowl on his face, and he says, "Hello, Dickie." And then Dickie says, "God damn, you got some balls. Last I heard, your sorry ass was in prison for killing my brother." And John replies, "Well, Sonny Jim, 2/3 is true. I was in prison. And while me ass is sorry, I didn't kill your brother. He did himself in." And then John just kind of stares back at him without saying anything, and Dickie does the same. He just stares down at John, except in Dickie's hand, we see he's holding the dart very hard, like he might stab John with it, but John is very casually just kind of holding his glass of whatever he's drinking. But instead of stabbing John, Dickie moves past John and stabs the bar with the dart, and he says, "Hey, Howard, set me up a jack." And Howard, the bartender, does just that, and then Dickie turns to John and says, "You?" Like he's offering to buy John a drink, which he does, and as he passes John the drink, John takes it and says, "Cheers." And then they clink their glasses, and John says, "To Lucky." And Dickie says, "Lucky, you're in a better place, baby brother." Then just as he says that, Howard the bartender smashes a fly on the window, and then he does something weird. He picks up the gross smashed body of the fly, and he sniffs it. And John watches this, and as he's about to take a drink, he says to what Dickie said about his baby brother being in a better place, "You might just be right there, Dickie, old son." Then we get to sometime later as Dickie is finishing his Jack Daniels, and he wipes his mouth and he looks at John and says, "So, that what you came down here for?" And John answers, "Not really, truth be told. Lucky's missus, though. I figure I owe her the same." And Dickie replies, "Yeah? I wouldn't say no one owes her shit." And John says, "That's a bit harsh considering." But apparently that was the wrong thing to say, because Dickie gets in John's face and says, "Fuck you." And John, who didn't really seem fazed by that, asks, "Something I don't know." And Dickie answers, "Fuck yeah." And John asks, "Care to divulge?" And then as Dickie plays with the dart on the bar top, he side-eyes John and says, "Fuck no." And then John looks at a dart and he asks, "Care to play?" And then Dickie drinks all of what's left in his glass and he says, "Yeah, right, conboy. Wouldn't say I'm exactly in your league now, would you?" But John persists, saying, "Come on now, a friendly game." And then Dickie puts down his glass and he looks at John very seriously and he says, "Who you trying to shit? Number one, ain't nothing friendly about you. And number two, ain't no game lest there's something for me to win." And then John says, "Fair enough, 20 around." And Dickie looks at John very hard and says, "Said for me to win, not to lose. I ain't playing." But even though he says that, he's still holding the dart, and then he turns around and kind of faces the board while still sitting. And John says to him, "Tell you what, I'll spot you 100 points, and you can go first. What do you say?" And to that, Dickie just throws the dart, and he gets a bullseye right away. And then he stands up and goes and gets it and says, "I say, game on." Then we turn the page, and it is sometime later after John and Dickie's game and drinking. And we see John and Dickie are walking into that warehouse where Richie had the man tied up and was knocking out his teeth. And as Dickie and John walk through the doors, we see he's got a hose and he is washing down the pillar where the man was and the floor as well. And the dog is playing in the water like it's having a lot of fun. And as Dickie and John walk in, Dickie says, "Richie, look who I found crawling out from under some rock." And Richie turns around and says, "John Constantine." And as he says that, he sprays John's foot with the water hose. And then Dickie says, "Easy, brother, easy. Johnny here didn't kill Lucky." And Richie looks at John and says, "He tell you that?" And then as Dickie walks over to a fridge and gets himself a beer, he says, "Goddamn right. It's what he said." But it's very obvious that Richie does not believe that, and so he stares at John very dead-faced, and he says, "Will you tell me the same?" And then John looks right back in his eyes and says, "Sure, Richie. I didn't murder your brother." Then we get this cool panel of Dickie standing in between the two men, and he's bringing them beers, but we can see Richie's hand is clenched very hard like he's going to do something to John, but John just has his hands casually in his pockets. And Dickie stares at Richie, and he asks, "So where in goddamn hell is Walter?" And as Dickie hands John a beer, Richie throws the hose down, and he says, Walter, he ain't coming." And we can kind of infer from that the man who Richie knocked the teeth out of and is now cleaning up probably the murder of was Walter. But Dickie hasn't quite put that together, so he says, "What? What the fuck, Richie? I told you." But he's cut off by Richie, who says, "Walter's gone, Dickie." And then he points to the floor with all the water on it, and he says, "He ain't never coming back, neither." And then Dickie finally gets it, and he says, "Fuck." Then he holds the cold beer to his head, and he says, "God damn, we're in a real fix." But then he has an idea, and he says, "Say, convoy, how about helping us out?" And John holds up his hand and says, "What? Listen here, Dickie. I just got out of the stir, and I'm in no mood to return." But Dickie says, "Jesus, goddamn it ain't like that. You got nothing to worry about." Then Richie chimes in, "He ain't shitting you, John. Ain't like the old days no more." And then Dickie says, "Come on, Constantine. Friendly game?" Kind of insinuating that, he played darts with John earlier, and they've kind of buried the hatchet, so John should help them out. But while he's saying that, in the panels where they're talking, there's some other panels that are kind of interspersed of the bloody pipe and the dog licking up bloody water that has teeth in it. So there is an implication that this is probably something really bad they're going to get John into. But it seems John goes with them because as we turn to the next page, we see John in the car with the two men, and very oddly, he's sitting in between the brothers in the front, and there's only two seats, so that means he's sitting on like the center console. So as they're driving, Dickie asks, "So how the fuck you know where to find us anywho?" And John answers, "A little bird told me." And then Dickie smiles and says, "Hear that, Richie? Guess you ain't the only one. Richie, he's quite the bird caller too." And then Richie says, "I don't call them, they call me." Then as the car pulls up to a house, Dickie says, "Tweet, tweet, tweet. You know what that means? We're here." Then we turn the page and we see John and Dickie walking into the house, and Dickie is saying to Richie outside, "Fire up that generator, Richie. Get the ladder too. We got us a big night. I fucking know it." And as they walk into this room, it's pretty dark, but we can see some shadowy stuff on the walls, and they all look kind of like weird S&M masks, and there's some lights, like if this is a film set or something. There's also a bed that is covered in cockroaches that the Mastiff dog immediately goes over to chew on, because of course they brought him as well. Then we see Dickie sit down at a table, and he pulls what looks like heroin out of his pocket, and on the table next to that bag of heroin are some needles that probably have already been used, and there's a spoon and a lighter, and Dickie says to John, "What do you say, Johnny? Pretty goddamn sweet, huh?" "Yes, sir." And as John looks at all the weird S&M stuff, and even like chains and whatnot hanging from the ceiling, which kind of looks like Hellblazer or something, John says, "Fucking Christ, Dickie. What you got yourself here?" But Dickie doesn't really respond. We just see the Mastiff dog come over to him and put his slobbery mouth on Dickie's jeans, and then Dickie gets mad and says, "Sit, you fuck. You're gonna knock my works over." Meaning, of course, his heroin and needles and stuff. So as he prepares that, we see John go over to a window, and he moves the curtain aside, and as he looks out, he sees a naked woman chained to a tree, and she's on her knees in front of the tree, and it looks like she's chained by the neck, like she's wearing a collar, and her hands and possibly her feet are tied behind her back. And as John sees this, Dickie says, "Say, conboy, I really appreciate this." And while John is still distracted by the naked woman outside, Dickie gets a light set up and he turns it on, and he's pointing it right at the back of John, and he says, "And I just want you to know what happened to Lucky. No hard feelings." But as he says that, he throws the heroin needle, much like the dart game earlier, right towards John's back. But we don't really see what happens because as we turn the page, we just cut back to the motel. And we see John walking in, and it's all dark. The bartender's no longer there because it is nighttime still. But John helps himself behind the bar, and he gets a bottle of Jack Daniels, and he pours himself a drink, and then he sits down and drinks it all in one gulp. And then he puts his head in his hands and he says, "My God, what have I done?" And that, my friends, is the end of the issue. We don't know what John has done, but I mean, we could maybe assume it was something to do with the naked woman, but I guess we'll have to wait to find out until next issue. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrainsandcomicbooks, all one word, @gmail.com, and we will see you on the next one.